You know, for years, World War I felt like a war that would just never end. It was this brutal, bloody stalemate. So how did it finally stop? Let's dig into the breaking point that brought one of the world's biggest conflicts to its knees.
Okay, before we dive into the grand strategy, let's just pause for a second. Put yourself in their shoes. It's 1917, 3 years of war. You're exhausted, you're probably starving, and you've seen things no one should ever have to see. What on earth keeps you fighting? And maybe more importantly, what's that one thing, that final straw that makes you say, I'm done, enough is enough? That's the real question, right? And millions of people were asking themselves that exact same thing.
And here's the thing. By 1917, that feeling, that breaking point, it wasn't just in one person's head. Entire nations were teetering right on the edge of total collapse.
The biggest problem, the word that really defined this whole period, was stalemate. For years, the war had been this grinding, bloody deadlock. I mean, think about it. Millions of lives were being spent just to capture a few miserable yards of mud. It was a horrifying meat grinder, and nobody had a clear way to win.
And I mean, just look at how bad things were getting everywhere. Governments were basically going bankrupt. They were running out of money, food, and, most tragically, soldiers. In France, troops were actually starting to mutiny, just refusing to fight. In Germany, the British naval blockade meant people at home were literally starving. And the old empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, they were just being torn apart from the inside. Every single major power was stretched to its absolute breaking point.
Okay, so you've got all these countries looking like dominoes ready to fall. Which one goes first? Well, that would be the Russian Empire, and its collapse would completely change the map of the entire war.
Inside Russia, things were an absolute mess. The country had suffered millions and millions of casualties at the front, and back home, there wasn't enough food or fuel to even get through the winter. And the guy in charge, Tsar Nicholas II, nobody trusted him anymore, not the people, and, this is crucial, not even his own army. So, by early 1917, you have these massive protests that just explode across the country, forcing the Tsar to do something that was once unthinkable.
He had to abdicate, which, is just the formal way of saying he gave up his throne. This was the end of centuries of Romanov rule in Russia. But the story wasn't quite over yet. So you have this huge power vacuum, right? And into that chaos steps a new group with a simple, brilliant, and incredibly powerful promise for a population that was absolutely desperate. Peace, land, and bread. Peace from the war, land for the peasants, and bread for the starving. Pretty hard to argue with that. And that group, they were called the Bolsheviks, a really radical socialist party led by this guy, Vladimir Lenin. And boy, did they see their chance. In what's known as the October Revolution, they grabbed control of the entire country, promising to make good on that slogan.
But getting that peace came with a huge price tag. It was a brutal trade-off. To get out of World War I, the Bolsheviks signed a treaty with Germany. The cost? They had to give up massive chunks of their territory, and the country immediately plunged into a terrible civil war of its own. So one war ended, but another began. For the rest of the world, though, the key takeaway was huge. One of the biggest players on the Allied side was suddenly gone.
So, with Russia out of the picture, everyone's looking at the Western Front and asking, okay, who's next? Are France and Britain gonna collapse too?
And they were hanging on by a thread. France just barely managed to get its army back in order after the mutinies, and they had to switch to a purely defensive strategy just to stop the bleeding. Britain, meanwhile, was just trying to stay afloat, pouring in resources from its colonies all over the world and, kind of desperately, looking across the Atlantic for a lifeline.
You know, this table really lays it all out, side by side. It shows those breaking points so clearly. And you can see some interesting patterns here, right? Look, Russia and Germany both faced crippling food shortages. But check out the different outcomes. Russia just implodes, has a revolution, and quits the war. France, dealing with its own crisis, decides to just dig in and try to hold on. And Germany's story? Well, it's kind of a mix of both, leading to this total collapse that will finally end the war.
All right, so this brings us to the final act, the two big events that would finally end this war, the arrival of a new superpower and the complete collapse of the German Empire.
So, in April 1917, the United States finally gets into the war. And the biggest impact wasn't even about winning battles right away. It was about a number. This number. 1 million fresh American troops started pouring into Europe, along with a tidal wave of industrial supplies. For the Allies, who are completely exhausted,
This was an unbelievable morale boost, but for Germany, it was basically a death sentence.
The German leaders, they knew the clock was ticking. They were in a race against time, so they launched one last, giant, desperate attack in the spring of 1918. It was called the Ludendorff Offensive. They were hoping to win the war before the Americans could really show up in force. It almost worked. It made some big gains at first, but in the end, it failed. And when that failed, well, everything just fell apart. The German people, starving and now totally hopeless, they rose up. The sailors mutinied, and on November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II did the exact same thing the Russian Tsar had done. He abdicated.
So the Kaiser's gone, a new government comes in, and they immediately ask for peace. Now, it's not a surrender, technically. It's what we call an armistice, which is basically an agreement between both sides to just stop fighting.
And just like that, after 4 long, brutal years of unimaginable bloodshed, it was coming to an end.
November 11th, 1918. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally went silent. The Great War was over.
Okay, so that leaves us with a big final question to chew on. We've seen these 2 huge, game-changing events happen in the final stretch of the war. But which one was more important? Was it Russia dropping out, which freed up German soldiers but also sent a message that a country could just quit? Or was it America jumping in, bringing fresh troops and a whole lot of hope to an allied cause that was on the verge of collapse? It's a fantastic question, something historians still debate, and it really gets to the heart of how this whole thing finally ended.